Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. As I was growing up, there was something about my grandparents' house that I never understood until years later. My grandparents lived in the lower part of South Carolina, in farmland far away from any town. What I didn't understand was on the back of their house, they had something they called the sleeping porch. This was a large screened-in porch, and of all things, it had a bed on it. Finally, when I was an adult, I put together that for most of their lives they didn't have air conditioning. And if you know anything about lower state South Carolina, you know that at times it can get quite warm. Summer evenings and nights can be hot and still. And I finally realized that the sleeping porch was there and had a bed on it in case it was just too hot inside to sleep. Instead of tossing and turning all night, you could go out on the porch where you might catch whatever slight breeze there could be and get some rest. In those old houses, it was a wonderful porch to have. Porches can be some of our favorite places. I love large front porches with rocking chairs on them, and in fact one of my favorite words is an old Southern term for porches. We sometimes call them verandas. This week we are looking at the temple in Jerusalem, and in particular the various parts of the temple and the things Jesus did in those places. The temple was the very center of Jewish religion and society as a whole, so it was not just important, it was vital. We started this week with Jesus in the innermost part of the temple that a regular person could enter, which was called the Court of Israel. And then yesterday we discussed Jesus in the Court of Women, where the collection boxes were. Today we want to talk about Jesus on Solomon's portico. Like veranda, portico is another word for porch, and sometimes you'll even see this area of the temple called Solomon's porch. The temple itself was the building, but it was built on top of a mountain, and they had leveled it off so that there was a large courtyard surrounding the building. This large courtyard was called the Court of Gentiles, and anyone could enter it, and that's our topic for tomorrow. But surrounding the outside of this large courtyard was a double row of columns, which became a favorite place for people to gather and discuss matters at hand. Some of these columns were massive, reaching as much as 100 feet tall. The columns to the east side of the Temple Mount were known as Solomon's portico, and like I said, it was a favorite place for people to gather. The Bible mentions Solomon's portico 3 separate times, and 2 of them are in the book of Acts, as Peter and other apostles are found preaching there after Jesus ascended into heaven. Our question for this week, however, is to talk about Jesus being in this place. There is speculation that Jesus visited Solomon's portico when he was just a boy and his parents lost him in Jerusalem. You likely remember that story about his parents going to Jerusalem for the Passover and then heading home, not realizing that the boy Jesus wasn't with them. At age 12, he could have been with his father in the front of the caravan or with his mother in the back. His parents likely assumed Jesus was with the other parent and only discovered that he wasn't at the end of the day. They rushed back to Jerusalem and searched for him, finally finding him in the temple, debating and discussing with the rabbis and priests there. It's a good bet that this was happening on Solomon's portico. There is also one specific instance in the ministry of Jesus that speaks of Solomon's portico and Jesus being there. In John 10, the Gospels tell us that it was time for the festival of the dedication and that Jesus was walking along Solomon's portico. The festival of dedication had come about after the Maccabees threw off the Syrian control of Israel and rededicated and sanctified the temple. Jews still observe this today. It's called Hanukkah. John is careful to point out that it was winter, and you know that Hanukkah is celebrated near our own Christmas holiday, so that makes sense. On that porch, Jewish leaders and priests gathered around him and demanded that he let them know plainly if he were the Messiah or not. Jesus answered, "I have already told you, and you haven't believed." They pushed the matter, and Jesus finally says, "My sheep know my voice, and no one can snatch them out of my hand." Things grow more and more heated as this discussion goes on, and eventually the Jews are so incensed that they pick up stones to throw at Jesus with the intent of stoning him to death for blasphemy. They saw him as human, and yet he claimed to be God. In their minds, this affront to God deserved the penalty of death. Finally, they tried to have Jesus arrested, but John tells us that Jesus escaped from their hands. Solomon's portico was the place where such matters were often discussed and debated, but it seems that they weren't ready to consider who Jesus really was. We often react badly to someone who challenges our preconceived assumptions and our controlled view of the world. Nevertheless, we don't have God controlled, and God often challenges us to grow and for our ideas to change. Maybe that's the lesson for us from what happened to Jesus on Solomon's portico. I guess, to borrow a phrase, what happens on the veranda shouldn't stay on the veranda. Be open to change. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.